Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avram Holedis Yitzchak, Yitzchak ben Abarim Shana, Bekachto as Rivka bas Pesuo. It talks about Yitzchak marrying Rivka, and they couldn't have any children. Vayerter Yitzchak Hashem Melech Ishto Ki Akarahi, and both Rivka and Yitzchak prayed to God so they could have kids. Vayerasel Lo Hashem Vatar Rivka Ishto. And Rashi, based on Chazal, tell us that God answered Yitzchak's tefillah, and Rivka was zocha to have kids. And the famous Rashi, why was Yitzchak answered in contrast to Rivka? Elahagid Shivcha. So Rashi quotes, because since Yitzchak was a tzaddik ben tzaddik, and Rivka was a tzaddikis bas Rasha, so hence Yitzchak's tefillah was answered. So it gives us an opportunity to discuss tefillah in general, and specifically, why should that make a difference? Does that make a difference if you're a tzaddik ben tzaddik or not? Doesn't God listen to everybody's tefillah? So in general, we have a machlokas Rambam and Ramban. Is what is the nature of the mitzvah of tefillah? Is prayer a biblical mitzvah or a rabbinical mitzvah? The Rambam writes, mitzvahs aseh l'spalo b'chol yom. The Rambam writes there's a positive mitzvah to daven every day, and according to the Rambam, so prayer is biblical daily. And the Ramban, Nechmanides, writes that no, that ordinarily tefillah is only d'Rabbanan. However, the Eis Sarah in the time of need, so then tefillah takes on the status of a biblical level, and like an earthquake, a war, etc. The Chatzosros, the Rambam writes over there, and so it seems to be a fundamental machlokas, the Rambam versus the Ramban, whether tefillah is biblical or rabbinical. Rav Soloveitchik points out that really it's more of a local machlokas. It's just a local issue. Really, everybody agrees tefillah be'eis sarah is daraisa. That is tefillah. When it's be'eis sarah, when you're turning to God in a time of need. As they say, there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. Everyone believes then. So what's the machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramban? It's a local machlokas. How do you define eis sarah, time of need? According to the Ramban, it's more of an external thing. Eis sarah means there's a war, there's a big fight, there's a real danger, there's an external danger, and therefore that takes it to a level of daraisa. However, the Rambam holds every day we all have sarahs daily, and that's considered biblical. So that's the machlokas Rambam regarding Eis sarah, but it's daraisa. Interesting. Some point out the Ramban in Parashas Emor Mekroi Kodesh that perhaps even though tefillah all year round or all week long might be rabbinical, but perhaps tefillah on Shabbos, that's a daraisa based on the pasuk Migroi Kodesh Kruei Ha'eda, that we learn out that perhaps it's not just limited to tefillah, but any type of public gathering of Torah tefillah, that might take it to a level of daraisa. That's the Pri Megadim. The Pri Megadim suggests this, according to the Ramban. So you have a machlokas Ramban regarding the nature of tefillah, whether it's biblical or rabbinical. And we know there's two types of prayer. There's tefillas hayachid, that an individual prays on their own, and then there's tefillah b'tzibur, davening in a congregation, davening in a tzibur. So perhaps, and the Gemara tells us that God listens to our tefillahs all the time, but if it's tefillah b'tzibur, so then for sure it's even a higher level, and therefore there is, if you want to have a better chance of your tefillah being answered, you should daven tefillah b'tzibur, and perhaps that Perhaps that could be the difference in terms of when would it make a difference, perhaps, if it's a tzaddik ben tzaddik or a tzaddik ben rasha, if you're davening tefillas yachid. But if it's tefillah b'tzibor, we're all equal, and therefore, then, so then it wouldn't make a difference. Others suggest perhaps another distinction. There's a famous Meshach Chachma in Parashas Vayechi, when the Torah talks about Becharbi uvakashti, which is sword and bow and arrow. And the Targum Onkelos, who usually translates literally word for word, writes Bisalusi uvausi. With its prayer, there's a different type of prayer. There's a deeper prayer and there's a higher level prayer. And he says Bisalusi uvausi. So he points out that what is the connection between a sword and a bow and arrow? So what forced the Targum to take it out of its regular order? Because he said when you're fighting a war, so back in the day before you had tanks and machine guns, so how did it work? First you shot the bow and arrow, people were far away, and then when you got closer, you took out the sword, you had hand-to-hand combat. So the Torah says, Becharbi uvachash, first your sword, then your bow and arrow. So obviously it can't mean the simple pshat war, therefore the Targum explains it to mean prayer. So the Meshach Chachma explained what is the difference between the prayer of Charbi and the prayer of Chasti. So the Meshach Chachma explains that we know there's the Shmona Esrei we have today from the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the 18 brachas, 19 brachas, and that's the Tfilas HaKavua, that it's in our prayer books, it's in our Sidurim, and that's what we daven all the time. And then there's the second Tfilah, personal Bakashas, where we add in at the appropriate times, during Rafa'inu about Refuah, during Fachachma, Tachal Antano, we add in our own prayer, our own personal Tfilas. So the Meshach Chachma writes, Chazal were in tune to how God wants the prayers to happen. So when we use the Tfilah HaKavua, so that by itself has a lot of powers. That's like the Charbi. The sword, you just have to nick the person in the wrong spot or the right spot, and the person will die right away if it's a very sharp sword. It doesn't take much effort. You just have to connect in the right spot. However, when it comes to bow and arrow, it's the more effort you put in, the more you're going to get out of it, the further it's going to go. If you don't pull it back, it's not going anywhere. So he says that's what Becharbi uvakashti. So when a person's davening the regular tefillah hakavua, then perhaps it doesn't make a difference, tzaddik ben tzaddik, tzaddik ben rasha. When you're asking your own personal bakasha, so perhaps maybe it's relevant. And along these lines, perhaps that's the pshat as well. The Gemara tells us in Brachas, and Beis, when it talks about tefillah keneged ma, why do we daven? What is shacharis mincha myra patterned after? So the Gemara says it's patterned. One opinion is it's patterned after the Avos, Avraham morning, Yitzchak mincha, and Yaakov myriv. And the other opinion is tefillah keneged karbanos. It corresponds to karbanos. And the Gemara concludes at the end, because the Gemara says, so if it's Keneged Karbanos, so I understand Musaf, but if it's Keneged Avos, where do we get Musaf? So the Gemara says it's Keneged Avos, but we also combine it with, so Avos and Karbanos are combined together. So they point out, what is the difference between Tefillah Keneged Avos and Tefillah Keneged Karbanos? What do they represent? So Tefillah Keneged Karbanos is it's a set, fixed tefillah. That like the Karbanos, you brought the same carbon every time, all the time, the same place, etc. And you always brought it the same way. In fact, that's why the concept of salt on the Mizbeach, or of Shimshon Hirsch explains, because salt is the ultimate preservative. So we want to show we're keeping the Masorah, we're doing things the way they used to be. So therefore, that's Tefillah Keneged Karbanos, it's the fixed tefillah. However, Tefillah Keneged Avos, that's a whole different ballgame. The Avos, Avraham had his issues, he prayed, Yitzchak had his issues, and Yaakov had his. And in fact, it's not just the same tefillah that we say 3 times a day, but they're fundamentally different. As we point out, Abraham is boker, is tefillah shacharis, and even though in Judaism, Ayer boker, the day begins at night, you would have thought that Avraham Avinu would have instituted Ma'ariv. No, shacharis, the rising sun, is during good times. We learn out from Avraham Avinu, we have an obligation to pray even during the good times. Hakaras hatov, not to take things for granted, and making sure we thank God and pray to God all the time. Yaakov is tefillah b'Eisara, darkness, nighttime, exile. His whole life he was on the run from Esav, from Lavan, with the whole Yosef incident. So Yaakov represents during times when it looks pretty bleak and down, that's the time. So we have, and it's pretty, and those are relatively easy. During good times you have plenty, so it's easier to pray. When it's during stressful times and difficult times, no one else could help, so therefore who else but to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But Tfilas Mincha, the Gemara says, is the most opportune time in terms of Tfilah being answered, because Eliyahu by Har Carmel, it was answered during Tfilas Mincha. So there's a pragmatic reason, is because that Shacharis in theory, something in the winter it's not so easy, but Shacharis in theory you can just wake up earlier and daven Shacharis. Ma'ariv, whenever you get home from work you could daven Ma'ariv, but Mincha to fit it in, especially during a winter day by 4:30, that takes a lot more effort, so pragmatically. But others explain it's not just pragmatically, but theologically as well, that because Tefillah represents, Yitzchak's Tefillah represents the in-between times, that basically Mincha, right now it's good, the sun's still out, but it's setting, and you see bad times are coming. So that's not so easy, to see the bad times, to see it's coming. So Mincha was always the most considered, and even Al Pi Kabbalah, there's something about Mincha being a time of Midas Hadin, so it's much harder, you have to balance the playing field. So each one, but the point being is that the Tefillah Keneger Karbanos represents the fixed Tefillah, the Tefillah HaKavua, and the Tefillah Keneger Avos, that represents our spontaneous Tefillah. Like we said, and that's the Charbi versus the Kashi, that's the sword, versus the bow and arrow. And that's the pshat, perhaps, that even though the bottom line, we have a Machokas Ramban, Tefillah Daraisa, the B'Eisara, maybe Shabbos is different, and we always accept the tefillahs of everybody, so perhaps that's by tefillah b'tzibor would make no distinction whatsoever. Perhaps individual, then it depends on your own schus, maybe schus avos of your parents, and that tefillah b'tzibor versus tefillah b'yachid. Or perhaps if you're doing your own personal bakasha, so then it depends on how far back you pull the bow and arrow, how much kavanah you have. But if you daven your tefillah kavua, that's like a charbi, that has enough power on its own, and therefore that's the pshat that Vayar Talo Yitzchak, the God answered Yitzchak and not Rivka, because Tzaddik ben Tzaddik versus the Tzaddik Bas Rasha.